It all started with the gnome. Not a metaphorical gnome, mind you. Not a nagging feeling or a small, persistent problem. I'm talking about an honest-to-God, ceramic, pointy-hatted, fishing rod-wielding garden gnome. His name was Norman. He was a gift from my 7-year-old daughter, Lily. And according to the official laminated document I was holding, he was a criminal. The letter had appeared this morning, tucked under the windshield wiper of my car like a parking ticket from the fun police. It was from the Manatee Meadows Homeowners Association, and it carried all the warmth and charm of a tax audit. Notice of violation. Property, 124 Sunrise Lane. Violation, Code 17, Subsection C, Paragraph 4. Unapproved placement of whimsical lawn decor. Details. The decorative gnome, Norman, located adjacent to the primary walkway, exceeds the maximum allowable height of 12 inches by a measured 1.5 inches. Furthermore, the chosen color palette of the gnome's attire, a vibrant, non-regulation blue tunic, is inconsistent with the approved community earth tone mandate. Action required. Remove the offending item within 24 hours to avoid a daily fine of $50. I stood on my perfectly manicured, HOA-approved fescue blend lawn and stared at Norman. He looked back at me, his cheerful, painted-on smile a tiny act of rebellion in this beige-tinted utopia. He was, to be fair, a pretty garish little dude, but he was my daughter's, and the idea that he was now an offending item made something in my brain short-circuit. All of this, was the handiwork of one woman, Brenda. As if summoned by my thoughts, the faint, menacing whine of an electric motor grew louder. I looked up to see her approaching. Brenda, president of the Manatee Meadows HOA, cruised down the street on her golf cart, a vehicle she had unironically nicknamed the Compliance Cruiser. It was painted the same soul-crushing taupe as our community's mailboxes. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of a shark patrolling a reef, her eyes scanning every lawn, every roof line, every trash can for the slightest infraction. She slowed as she passed my house, her gaze flicking from me to the laminated letter in my hand, and finally to Norman. She didn't stop, didn't say a word. She just gave me a slow, deliberate nod, the corners of her mouth turning up into a smile so tight it could have squeezed juice from a rock. It was a smile that said, "Yes, I measured your gnome, and I'd do it again." I gave her a big, goofy thumbs up and an equally exaggerated grin. The mask of civility was all we had left. Brenda's ascent to power was the stuff of local legend, whispered about over fences and at neighborhood barbecues. Manatee Meadows hadn't always been like this. Our previous HOA president was a retiree named Gary who was elected on a simple, 3-word platform: clean the pool. Gary was a man of the people. His reign was a golden age of reasonable expectations. You could leave your Christmas lights up until mid-January without receiving a formal reprimand. You could plant petunias that weren't on the pre-approved floral list. It was glorious, chaotic freedom. Then came the great potluck coup of 2022. Brenda, then just a member of the Architectural Review Committee, saw her opening. At the sparsely attended annual HOA meeting, held on a Tuesday morning when most sane people were at work, she orchestrated her takeover. It involved a confusing flurry of proxy votes she had collected on what she claimed was a sign-up sheet for the neighborhood potluck. Before anyone knew what was happening, Gary was out and Brenda was in. Her first act as president was to cancel the potluck, citing potential liability issues and non-compliance with community dietary guidelines. Her reign since had been a masterclass in petty tyranny. She introduced the approved mailbox number font mandate, leading to a 2-week civil war between the serif and sans serif factions of the community. She decreed that all residential trash and recycling bins must be retrieved from the curb within 45 minutes of the truck's departure, a rule that created a frantic post-pickup scramble for anyone with a job. Her magnum opus was the Seasonal Wreath Color Palette Initiative, a 30-page document outlining which specific shades of pastel were acceptable for spring and which earth tones were permitted in the fall. Winter wreaths were, of course, subject to their own separate, equally lengthy addendum. Living here was like being in a low-stakes witness protection program, where the only thing you were hiding from was joy. "Morning, Alex." I turned. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was standing by our shared hedge, holding the leash of his scruffy little terrier, Barnaby. Mr. Henderson was a widower in his late 70s, a genuinely sweet man who seemed to be in a constant state of low-grade terror. Barnaby was his whole world. "Morning, George," I said, folding the violation notice and stuffing it in my pocket. "Don't let Brenda see you. I think that shade of green on Barnaby's leash is aggressively verdant and might be out of compliance." He gave a weak, nervous chuckle. "Don't even joke. I got a warning yesterday." "You're kidding. For what?" He sighed, shaking his head. "The wind chimes. Apparently they're creating auditory pollution. She said they exceeded the approved decibel range for passive atmospheric music generators." Passive atmospheric music generators?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "She actually said that?" "It was in the email," he said glumly. "She suggested I replace them with a decorative rock." Barnaby, oblivious to the oppressive regime we lived under, let out a happy little yip. Mr. Henderson immediately shushed him. "Quiet now, boy. Don't want another noise complaint." I looked from the cowed old man and his happy dog to the spot where Norman stood, a tiny ceramic beacon of defiance. This wasn't just about a gnome anymore. This was about the slow, methodical strangulation of everything that wasn't beige, quiet, and pre-approved, and I was getting damn sick of it. That afternoon, I moved Norman. Not to the garage or the trash, but to a new, more prominent position right next to my front door. Then, I went to my toolbox and got out my fine-tipped paintbrushes. An hour later, Norman was no longer holding a fishing rod. He was holding a tiny, hand-painted sign that read in perfect serif font, "Compliance is optional." The war had begun. Every man reaches a point where he looks at his backyard and thinks, "You know what this needs? More places to sit." For me, that moment arrived on a sweltering Tuesday in July. My existing concrete slab of a patio was a sad, cracked testament to the builder's indifference. It radiated heat like a pizza stone and had all the charm of a freeway overpass. My dream was simple, humble even. I wanted a deck. A composite deck, to be precise. A place to put my grill, a table, and a couple of chairs. A platform from which I could enjoy a cold beer and watch the lazy flow of the canal behind our house without my feet getting scorched. I knew, of course, that this dream would have to pass through the fiery gates of HOA hell, a process overseen by the archdemon of architectural review herself, Brenda. But I was determined. I was going to have my deck. After a week of research, I found my guy. His name was Sal, and his company was called No Nonsense Decks, a name that immediately appealed to me. Sal was a big man with a permanent squint and hands like catcher's mitts. He looked like he'd spent his life wrestling lumber into submission, and he probably had. He came over, took one look at my backyard, and nodded. "Yep, we can do this," he said, his voice a low rumble. 16 by 20, composite. Picture frame border, hidden fasteners. It'll be a beauty." "There's just one thing," I said, handing him the thick, spiral-bound tome that was the Manatee Meadows covenants, conditions, and restrictions. "We have to get it approved by the HOA." Sal took the book from me, its weight seeming to surprise him. He flipped through the pages, his squint deepening. He stopped on a page, read for a moment, and then let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a rock tumbler starting up. "Buddy," he said, slapping the book shut. "This ain't a covenant, it's a manifesto. Hold on." All decking materials must be selected from the approved color palette. See Addendum F, Chart 12B. He shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "This Brenda lady? She's a special one, ain't she?" "You have no idea," I muttered. "Oh, I got some idea," Sal chuckled. "Last year I did a job over in Cypress Creek. HOA there had a rule against obtrusive screw heads. Had to use special countersunk color-matched screws that cost $8 apiece. The year before that, a place in Heron's Landing made me submit a soil sample to make sure the deck posts wouldn't disrupt the subterranean ecosystem, which, as far as I could tell, was just fire ants and disappointment. We spent the next hour strategizing like generals planning an invasion. Sal, a veteran of the HOA wars, knew the enemy's tactics. "Here's what we do," he said, pulling out a colored chart. "We don't give her anything to shoot at. We go boring. We go so boring it hurts. No fancy curves, no two-tone colors. We pick the most middle-of-the-road, inoffensive color on this chart. Something that screams, 'I have given up on life.'" His finger landed on a swatch. The color's name was Depressing Taupe. "Perfect," I said. We drew up the plans. A simple rectangle, standard railings, everything meticulously documented, every measurement triple-checked against Brenda's book of rules. We submitted the package to the Architectural Review Committee, which was really just Brenda and two of her terrified cronies. Then we waited. The first rejection came a week later via email. Subject: Deck application. 124 Sunrise Lane. Pending revision. Dear Mr. Miller, the committee has reviewed your proposal. While we appreciate your adherence to the standard rectangular form, we have identified an issue with the proposed railing height. At 36 inches, it is not conducive to the established community sightlines along the Canal waterway. Please revise and resubmit. Sincerely, Brenda. "Community sightlines?" I said to Sal over the phone. "What does that even mean? Is she worried it'll block her view of the manatees from her golf cart?" "It means she's messing with you," Sal said. "Just drop it to 34 inches and send it back." We did. The second rejection arrived 3 days later. Subject: Deck application, revision 1, 124 Sunrise Lane. Pending revision. Dear Mr. Miller, thank you for your revised submission. Unfortunately, a new issue has been identified. The selected color, Depressing Taupe, SKU #743DT, is deemed too similar in hue and finish to the Forbidden Fawn, see Addendum G, Chart 3A, used exclusively on the trim of the community center. This could cause brand dilution for the community's aesthetic identity. Please select an alternative from the approved palette and resubmit. Sincerely, Brenda. "Brand dilution?" I yelled, reading the email to Sal. "It's a deck, not a corporate logo. Is she insane?" "She's playing the game, Alex," Sal said, his voice calm. "She wants you to give up. We just pick another boring color. How about Restful Grage?" "Fine," I grumbled. "Let's go with Restful Grage." The third rejection was the masterpiece. It was the Mona Lisa of petty bureaucratic obstruction. Subject: Deck application. Revision 2. 124 Sunrise Lane. Final review pending. Dear Mr. Miller, the committee acknowledges the change to Restful Grage. However, a significant concern has been raised regarding the potential environmental impact. Your proposed structure will cast a shadow over a portion of the canal for several hours a day. The committee requires a formal impact study conducted by a licensed environmental consultant to determine what effect this new shadow pattern may have on the canal's delicate algae growth and the general well-being of the local sunfish population. Please provide this report at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Brenda. I stared at the email, my mouth hanging open. A sunfish impact study. For a deck? I was losing the will to live. I could picture Brenda typing it, a smug little smile on her face, knowing she had finally found the perfect, unbreakable wall of nonsense to hide behind. That's it, I told Sal. I'm done. She wins. I'll just live with my cracked concrete slab forever. Hold on now, don't you quit, Sal said, his voice firm. I've seen this move before. It's the last desperate throw. I know a guy at the university, a biology grad student. For $100, he'll write you a one-page report that says your deck shadow will actually create a thriving new micro-ecosystem. We'll bury her in fake science. Sal, feeling confident that this final hurdle was just a formality, made a tactical error. He had a gap in his schedule and a good deal on materials from his supplier, so he had the lumber, the composite boards, and all the hardware delivered to my house. The mountain of materials was stacked neatly on the side of my driveway, covered by a heavy-duty tarp, and well out of the way. It took exactly 58 minutes. I was in my office when I heard the now familiar whine of the compliance cruiser. I looked out the window to see Brenda standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand, staring at the pile of materials like it was a crashed UFO. She took several pictures with her phone, made some notes, and then strode to my front door. I met her on the porch. "Alex," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I see you have some supplies." "They're for a project, Brenda," I said, my teeth clenched. "Yes, but the project has not been approved," she countered, tapping her clipboard. According to Section 42, Paragraph 8, the storage of construction materials on a residential property constitutes the creation of an unapproved construction staging area. It's an aesthetic violation. "Brenda, it's a neat pile of wood on my own driveway. It'll be gone in a week." "The rules are the rules," she chirped, handing me another laminated violation notice. "You'll be fined $50 for every day the materials remain on the property. Have a lovely afternoon." She turned and glided back to her cart, leaving me standing there with the notice in my hand. It wasn't about the money, it was the principle. She was fining me for a project she was actively, maliciously blocking. This was no longer just a game. This was war, and I had a big pile of lumber that was now my personal hill to die on. The air on that Saturday afternoon was thick and heavy, like a wet wool blanket. The Florida heat had beaten the entire neighborhood into a state of lethargic submission. The only sounds were the distant hum of an air conditioner and the rhythmic buzz of cicadas. It was the kind of lazy, oppressive day where the most ambitious plan you could make was to move from a chair in the sun to a chair in the shade. I was on my sad, cracked concrete slab, nursing a cold beer and staring at the monument to my frustration stacked in the driveway. The pile of restful grayish composite decking, shimmering in the heat, seemed to be mocking me. The Sunfish Impact Study, a glorious work of fiction involving enhanced phytoplankton habitats, had been submitted 2 days ago. I hadn't heard back. Brenda was no doubt letting it marinate, savoring her power. My gaze drifted down the lawn to the canal. The water, murky and green, flowed slowly toward the intercoastal. On the concrete bank, Mr. Henderson was taking Barnaby for his afternoon walk. The little terrier was trotting along happily, his nose to the ground, his tail a furry, wagging metronome. Mr. Henderson looked older today, more stooped, the heat taking its toll. He gave me a weary wave, and I raised my bottle in return. It was a perfectly normal, miserably hot Saturday, a scene of quiet, suburban stillness. And then, in an instant, It wasn't. Barnaby, in hot pursuit of a particularly plump and audacious dragonfly, took one step too close to the edge. His back paw slipped on a patch of slick algae. There was a surprised yelp, a splash, and then a horrifying silence. I was on my feet before my brain had fully processed what happened. "Barnaby!" Mr. Henderson's voice was a thin, reedy cry of pure panic. I vaulted over my sad little porch railing and sprinted across the lawn. When I got to the edge of the canal, the scene was worse than I imagined. Barnaby was paddling furiously, his little head barely above the water. He was trying to get back to the wall, but there was nothing to hold on to. The concrete sides were sheer, dropping 4 feet to the water's surface, with no ladder and no ledge. The current, while not strong, was just enough to pull him slowly downstream away from us. "Help him," Mr. Henderson pleaded, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Alex, please, you have to help him." He was fumbling with his phone, his hands shaking too badly to dial. He was too old, too frail to even consider going in after the dog. My first instinct was to jump in, but I stopped myself. Getting Barnaby would be easy. Getting myself and a panicked 40-pound dog back out of a canal with 4-foot sheer walls would be nearly impossible. I could end up in as much trouble as he was. "The rescue bags!" I yelled, my mind suddenly clearing. "Stay here, George!" I turned and ran. County ordinance, a rare piece of sensible regulation that had predated Brenda's reign, had mandated the installation of emergency throw bags every 50 yards along the canal. They were in bright orange cases, clearly marked, impossible to miss. A lifeline, waiting for a moment just like this. I reached the nearest station, my lungs burning. I flipped the latch on the plexiglass case and my heart sank into my stomach. It was empty. No, it wasn't just empty. There was something inside. Taped neatly to the back of the case was a single laminated sheet of paper. Notice: all community-owned safety equipment has been temporarily removed for annual inventory and aesthetic review by the HOA board. A vote on new, color-compliant rope casings will be held at the next quarterly meeting. We apologize for any inconvenience and ask that you please refrain from having water-based emergencies at this time. The blood drained from my face. I read the last line again. Please refrain from having water-based emergencies at this time. It was so perfectly, so psychotically Brenda, that for a second I thought I was hallucinating. "Alex!" Mr. Henderson's cry was more desperate now. I didn't waste another second. I sprinted to the next station 50 yards down. Maybe it was just the one. Maybe she hadn't gotten to this one yet. Hope flared in my chest for a brief, beautiful moment before being brutally extinguished. The second case was also empty, bearing the exact same insane laminated notice. She had taken them all, every single one, to conduct an aesthetic review. I looked back at the canal. Barnaby was noticeably weaker, his frantic paddling slowing to a desperate, tiring doggy paddle. He let out a weak whine that cut right through me. Mr. Henderson was on his knees on the concrete, his hand outstretched over the water, sobbing. A cold, hard rage unlike anything I had ever felt washed over me. It wasn't about gnomes or decks or the color beige anymore. This was real. A sweet old man was about to watch his best friend drown because of this woman's obsessive, pathological need for control. Barnaby didn't have minutes. He had seconds. And I was standing there with nothing but useless empty boxes and a laminated notice from the depths of bureaucratic hell. For a solid 2 seconds, my mind was a blank screen of white-hot panic. The image of Barnaby's struggling form and the sound of Mr. Henderson's desperate sobs were a sensory overload. My feet were planted on the ground, but my brain was spinning, cycling through a Rolodex of useless options. Jump in? Can't get out? A rope? Don't have one long enough. The lumber for the deck? Too heavy, too slow. Then, My eyes locked on the pile of materials in my driveway, the monument to my frustration, and suddenly, the jumbled mess of supplies wasn't a symbol of defeat anymore. It was an arsenal. My brain, which usually spent its processing power on spreadsheets and remembering my Netflix password, suddenly kicked into a high-gear emergency inventor mode I didn't know it possessed. It started connecting things, seeing possibilities. A line. I need to get a line across the canal. How do you get a line across a 50-foot gap, fast? You throw it. No, you need to throw it with a weight. What's a weight? What's a line? How do you throw it far enough? The images clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. The line. A brand new spool of bright orange, high-tensile mason's line Sal had dropped off. Thin, strong, and 500 feet of it. Perfect. The weight. A half-empty, 1-gallon can of restful grage deck stain. Heavy enough to fly, not so heavy it would sink like a stone. The launcher. This was the stroke of insane genius. Sal's pneumatic, contractor-grade caulk gun. It wasn't for dainty little tubes of bathroom sealant. This was a cannon designed to shoot viscous construction adhesive out of huge canisters. It ran off an air compressor and had the stopping power of a small horse. It was the stupidest idea I'd ever had. It was a cartoon solution to a real-life problem. It was my only shot. "George!" I yelled, my voice cracking with adrenaline. "Hang on!" I sprinted to the driveway, my mind a frantic checklist. I grabbed the spool of orange line, jamming a screwdriver through the center to act as an axle. I snatched the can of deck stain. I grabbed the caulk gun, which was still attached to its air hose, snaking back to the compressor in my garage. I hit the switch on the compressor, and it roared to life. "Dave!" I screamed across the canal. My neighbor, Dave, a perpetually bewildered IT manager, was on his patio, drawn by the commotion. He was staring, phone in hand, looking like he was about to call 911. "Dave, I'm about to shoot a paint can at you. Catch the damn paint can!" His face went through a rapid series of emotions. Confusion, fear, and then, bless his heart, a flicker of dawning comprehension. He gave me a hesitant nod and put his phone down. The next 60 seconds were a blur of frantic, fumbling action. I tied the end of the mason's line to the paint can's metal handle, using a knot I vaguely remembered from a Boy Scouts meeting 25 years ago. I prayed it would hold. I jammed the base of the paint can into the wide mouth of the caulk gun's barrel. It was a snug fit. Too snug. I slammed it in harder. It wedged into place. The compressor coughed and sputtered, reaching its maximum PSI. The whole setup felt profoundly, deeply unsafe. I glanced back at the water. Barnaby was barely moving now, his nose just tipping above the surface. I was out of time. I planted my feet, aimed high over the canal, and squeezed the trigger. The result was far more dramatic than I'd anticipated. There was a deafening thwomp sound, a powerful recoil that nearly knocked me off my feet, and the can of restful grage shot out of the caulk gun. It sailed through the air in a majestic, wobbling arc, trailing the bright orange mason's line behind it like the tail of a comet. For a second, it was a thing of beauty. Then I remembered it was a gallon of paint flying towards my neighbor's head. "Heads up!" I bellowed. Dave, to his eternal credit, reacted like a pro baseball player. He dove, arms outstretched, and caught the can against his chest with a loud oof. He landed hard on his pristine lawn but held on tight. He'd done it. We had a line across the canal. "Don't let go!" I yelled, already working. I ran the line from my side through a loop I made at the end of the spool, creating a rudimentary pulley system. "Make a bigger loop, Dave. We need to get it around the dog." Working together from opposite sides of the canal, we managed to guide the slack of the rope into the water, maneuvering the loop around the now limp body of the little terrier. We got it underneath his front legs. "Okay, pull, gently," I shouted. We started pulling, hand over hand, drawing the exhausted dog toward the safety of the canal bank on Dave's side. He was almost there. 10 more feet. 5. Just as Dave was reaching down to haul him out of the water, a new sound cut through the air, the high-pitched, infuriated whine of an electric motor pushed to its limits. The compliance cruiser screeched to a halt on the grass behind me, gouging 2 perfect taupe-colored divots in my lawn. Brenda leaped out, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes weren't on the drowning dog, or the terrified old man, or the incredible feat of improvised engineering we had just pulled off. They were fixed on the caulk gun in my hand. "What in the name of the HOA charter are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that only dogs and bats were meant to hear. "That is an unapproved projectile. You are in violation of waterway airspace, noise ordinances, and Section 28, regarding the discharge of unlicensed pneumatic devices." I stared at her, dumbfounded. The sheer, monumental disconnect from reality was staggering. Barnaby was literally being pulled from the jaws of death 3 feet away, and she was citing bylaws. The rage that had been simmering inside me finally boiled over. "Are you kidding me?" I roared back, my voice raw. You hid the rescue bags. You took down the emergency equipment. Barnaby almost drowned because you wanted to conduct an aesthetic review on the color of the rope. This isn't a violation, you clipboard-wielding tyrant. It's a rescue. Your failure to plan for an emergency does not permit you to launch hazardous materials across community property," she screeched back. Our shouting match had become the main event. Neighbors were emerging from their air-conditioned homes, their faces pressed against windows or cautiously stepping onto their lawns. It was at this moment, with a rescued dog shivering on one bank and 2 adults screaming at each other on the other, that the actual cavalry arrived. A police car, lights flashing but siren off, pulled up to the curb. 2 officers got out. One was young, with a fresh haircut and an earnest, by-the-book expression. The other was older, with a mustache that looked like it had seen and heard things it wished it could forget. He had the deeply weary, profoundly tired energy of a man who had been called to one too many suburban disputes. Brenda saw them and immediately shifted gears. She smoothed her blouse, composed herself, and marched toward them, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Thank heavens, officers," she declared, her voice now filled with fake victimhood. "Arrest this man. He's been firing a construction weapon in a residential area. He nearly took my head off." The older cop, whose name tag read SGT Evans, looked from Brenda's frantic face to the paint can on the far side of the canal, to the dripping wet dog, to the caulk gun in my hand, and finally, to the heavens. He let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the absurdity in the world. This was going to be a long afternoon. Sergeant Evans had a presence. It wasn't intimidating, not exactly. It was more like a gravitational field of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. He moved like a man who had already used up all his allotted surprises for the decade and was just running on fumes and procedure. His younger partner, Officer Miller, was the opposite. All sharp angles and alert energy, his hand hovering near his notepad as if he was ready to document the crime of the century. "Okay," Sergeant Evans began, his voice a low, tired drone that somehow cut through the tension. "Somebody want to tell me what's going on here in 20 words or less?" Brenda, naturally, took this as her cue. She launched into a dramatic, high-speed monologue that was definitely more than 20 words. "Officer, it was horrifying. I was conducting a routine community standards inspection when this man," she pointed at me with the theatricality of a stage actress, "unleashed an unprovoked attack. He discharged a high-powered pneumatic cannon, launching a canister of hazardous chemicals across the waterway, endangering pets, wildlife, and innocent bystanders like myself. It's reckless endangerment, vandalism. Look at the ruts his projectile left on Mr. Henderson's lawn." Dave from across the canal yelled, "It landed on my lawn, Brenda, and you're welcome. Sergeant Evans held up a hand, a silent command for quiet. He turned his tired eyes to me. "The cannon?" he asked, a flicker of something, maybe not amusement but professional curiosity, in his expression. I held up the caulk gun. "It's a caulk gun, Sergeant, and the hazardous chemical is deck stain." I took a deep breath, determined to sound like the only sane person present. "Mr. Henderson's dog, Barnaby, fell into the canal. I ran to get the emergency throw bag, but the station was empty. They were all empty. Someone," I shot a pointed look at Brenda, "had removed them." Officer Miller, the rookie, perked up at that. "The safety equipment was missing?" "Not missing," I said, walking them over to the nearest empty station. "It was inventoried." I pointed at the laminated sign, still neatly taped inside the empty case. Miller leaned in and read it aloud, his voice full of disbelief. "Please refrain from having water-based emergencies at this time." He looked at his partner. "Sergeant, is that even legal?" Sergeant Evans's mustache twitched. He turned his full, weighty attention to Brenda, who was starting to look less like a confident complainant and more like a cornered badger. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "I'm going to ask you a simple, direct question. Did you, an unauthorized civilian, remove county-mandated public safety equipment from its designated emergency post?" Brenda's composure finally cracked. She sputtered, "I am the HOA president. I wasn't an unauthorized civilian. I was a community leader securing assets. The bags were faded. The ropes were a non-compliant shade of yellow. They needed to be reviewed. It's in the bylaws." "Ma'am, I don't care if it's in the Magna Carta," Evans said, his patience visibly evaporating. "That equipment is there for a reason. You tampering with it is a serious offense, a very serious one." He looked over at Barnaby, who was now wrapped in a towel in Mr. Henderson's arms, shivering but safe. "Especially when a stunt like this almost gets a dog killed." The color drained from Brenda's face. The words, "serious offense," seemed to finally penetrate her thick shell of self-righteousness. Officer Miller was now writing furiously in his notepad. The tide had turned. The story of the caulk gun rescue became an instant legend in Manatee Meadows. It had everything: a damsel, or dog, in distress, a resourceful hero, and a villain of such astonishing pettiness that you couldn't help but root against her. By Monday, the community message board was on fire. An emergency HOA meeting was called for Wednesday night. The community center's multipurpose room, which usually hosted sparsely attended meetings about lawn fertilizer, was packed to the gills. It was standing room only. I walked in and was greeted with a wave of applause and pats on the back. People I'd only ever nodded to were shaking my hand. Sal, my contractor, was there, grinning from ear to ear. "Heard my caulk gun became a hero," he boomed, clapping me on the shoulder. Brenda stood at the podium at the front of the room, looking pale and defiant. She tried to open the meeting by discussing a new proposal regarding approved driveway sealant finishes, but she was immediately shouted down. "We're not here to talk about driveways, Brenda," someone yelled. Then Mr. Henderson stood up, holding Barnaby, who was wearing a little doggy sweater. The room fell silent. "For 5 years," he began, his voice trembling with emotion. "This little guy has been all I have. He's my family, and I almost lost him. I almost watched him drown right in front of me. Not because of an accident, but because our safety equipment was locked away. Because someone decided that the color of a rescue rope was more important than a life." He looked directly at Brenda. "I don't feel safe in a community that values rules more than neighbors. I don't think any of us do." That was it. The dam broke. A motion was made from the floor to hold an immediate vote of no confidence in Brenda as HOA president. It was seconded by a dozen people at once. The vote was a landslide. Brenda was out. In the chaos that followed, Gary, the old, relaxed president, was reluctantly dragged out of retirement and installed as the interim leader. He looked vaguely confused but pleased. He shuffled up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and said, "Okay then, first order of business. All in favor of approving Alex Miller's deck, exactly as he wants to build it. Say aye." A deafening roar of "Aye!" filled the room. Gary looked at me and winked. "Motion passes, meeting adjourned, let's go clean the pool." A few weeks later, the world looked different from my backyard. I was sitting on my brand new, beautiful non-taupe deck. It was a lovely shade of coastal gray. Sal was there, along with Gary and Mr. Henderson. We were drinking cold beers and watching the sun set over the canal. The grill was smoking, loaded with burgers. At my feet, Barnaby was happily chewing on a toy, occasionally nudging my leg for a scratch behind the ears. My daughter Lily had made a new addition to the deck's decor. Norman, the gnome who started it all, was perched on the railing. He was no longer holding a sign. Now he was wearing a tiny, hand-sewn red superhero cape that fluttered in the evening breeze. There was a final letter from Brenda, delivered by a lawyer, threatening legal action for public defamation and procedural improprieties. I used it as a coaster for my beer. The reign of beige terror was over. The sunfish were presumably thriving in the shadow of my deck. The wind chimes were chiming, and for the first time in a long time, Manatee Meadows felt like a community. It felt like home,